Hello again everyone, and welcome back to Learn Linux TV. In today's video, we're going to check out the Raspberry Pi version of Pop! OS, which was just recently released. I can't wait to dive in and give you guys my thoughts. And you know what? This video is somewhat timely because Pop! OS is all over the news lately. In fact, Linus from Linus Tech Tips recently checked out Pop! OS, and he did a video about that, actually several videos about that. And unfortunately, things didn't go so well for him. He had some issues with, the desktop getting uninstalled and some other weird things. I can't really understand how exactly he ended up in that position. And in light of Linus's recent debacle, I'm even wearing a t-shirt to mark the occasion because, I don't know, maybe Linus would have had a better experience if he watched Learn Linux TV. Anyway, right here I have my trusty Raspberry Pi 400, and this is the device that I decided to use for this review. And that kind of makes sense. Pop! OS is a desktop distribution, and the Raspberry Pi 400 is intended for desktop use, so I figured I would check it out and see how it goes. And you know what? I'm really excited that Pop! OS is available for the Raspberry Pi. I mean, it's such a wonderful platform that caters to all kinds of audiences out there, whether you're a Linux fan, a home labber, a do-it-yourselfer, or even a retro gamer. There's no shortage of operating system choices for the Raspberry Pi, and even though Raspberry Pi OS is pretty much the official operating system for the Pi, other distributions such as Ubuntu have gotten in on the act too, and now we can add another one to the list, Pop! OS. Pop! OS itself is a very popular x86 distribution for notebooks and desktops, and with good reason. It's great. It's actually my favorite distro. And what's so amazing about this release is that Pop! OS was ported so well to the Pi that if you were merely looking at screenshots, you wouldn't even be able to tell the difference at all. Now, I've already done a review about the x86 version of Pop! OS 2110, so go ahead and check out that video if you're curious what's changed. Spoiler alert, not all that much. But now it's time to check it out on the Raspberry Pi. It's definitely an impressive port, however, there's some rough edges with this release as well that we'll talk about later. Perhaps more importantly, I'll also answer the question, was porting Pop! OS to the Pi even a good idea in the first place? Now, before we get into the actual review, I want to take a moment to mention the sponsor for today's video, Linode. Linode is actually the official infrastructure provider for Learn Linux TV. All of the web presence for Learn Linux TV runs on Linode, and I couldn't be happier with the platform. And you can get your very own Linode instance, a cloud server, set up in minutes. And using the URL that you see on the screen right now, will get new customers access to $100 in free credit, and that credit is good for 60 days. And considering that they have instance types that cost as little as $5 per month, there's a whole lot of Linux you could fit within that credit. Their platform is fast, it's very responsive, and it's now even more responsive considering that NVMe-based block storage is rolling out to their customers right now. And you could use their platform to spin up a web app such as Nextcloud, you could set up a blog for yourself, or even build your own VPN server. And even if you're not feeling especially creative when it comes to what to use your Linode server for, it's also a great platform that you can use for spinning up Linux servers that you can use to go through any of the countless tutorials that are available here on Learn Linux TV. And they have a lot of distributions available. Their list includes, but is not limited to, favorite distributions like Debian, Ubuntu, CentOS, Alma Linux, and, believe it or not, Arch Linux as well. So definitely check out Linode. I really appreciate their continued sponsorship of Learn Linux TV. They're an awesome company, they have an awesome service, and well, this is an awesome YouTube channel, so I guess it all fits. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and check out the Pop! OS release for the Raspberry Pi. First and foremost, Pop! OS is a Linux distro that's definitely increasing in popularity. And System76, the makers of Pop! OS, they do a great job at tweaking their distro in just the right way in order to make it run very well on laptops and desktops. It's just a great experience. And for me, on each of my computers, yes, that's right, I run Pop! OS on pretty much everything, the distro runs really great on my hardware, and I really can't complain. I just love the quality of life improvements that System76 adds to their distro. The Raspberry Pi version, which I'm reviewing today, is a brand new version of Pop that didn't exist before now. And, well, that could be a good thing because it's yet another platform that we can enjoy Pop! OS on. On my end, I downloaded the image for this new Pi spin on the same rig that I used to review the desktop version of Pop! OS 2110, and Pop! OS itself actually comes with a utility that you can use to flash a Raspberry Pi image onto an SD card, Or you could use USB Imager or whatever your chosen solution happens to be. Basically, you just write the SD card image to the SD card, boot from it, and from there, you just walk through the various screens and you're good to go. Now, I mentioned that on my end, I went ahead and used Pop! OS itself, the utility that they include, to flash the SD card for my installation. And that tool has a pretty humorous name. It's called Popsicle. I just downloaded the image and immediately tried to flash it with that tool. But what's strange, though, is that Popsicle didn't even recognize the file format. The Pop! OS image for the Pi is downloaded in a compressed XZ format, but Popsicle, for some reason or another, didn't want to have anything to do with that. In fact, it didn't even show up in the list of images that I could flash to the SD card. But that didn't stop me. I mean, this isn't the first time that I've run into an XZ compressed image before, and I knew what to do right away. I uncompressed the image using the onXZ command, and after I did that, immediately Popsicle was able to recognize the image type and then flash it to the SD card. I have to say, though, I find it a little weird that System76 releases their image for the Raspberry Pi as an XZ compressed image, and their own utility doesn't recognize it. So I suppose if I didn't already know about the onXZ command, I probably wouldn't know what to do and I'd have to do some research to find out. So maybe that's something they can fix, but I wanted to mention that in case anyone out there is planning on using Popsicle to flash the image, you will need to uncompress it first. Anyway, after you flash the SD card and boot from it, you'll see a series of screens that'll help you configure your operating system. And it's here that I ran into a bit of an issue. My screen recorder records in 4K, so it's seen by whatever I hook up to it as a 4K display. With Pop! OS on x86, it normally has no problem here at all. It's intelligent enough to resize itself such that everything doesn't appear too small and hard to read. But on the Pi version, at least for me, it didn't enlarge anything. I had a lot of trouble reading anything on the screen. Due to this problem, at the very beginning, during the initial boot process when it asks you a series of questions to set up your installation, I felt very clumsy when it comes to clicking on things and I was barely able to read anything, so it took me a lot longer than I would like to go through that process. And that's really weird considering that the x86 version of Pop! OS doesn't have any issues when it comes to 4K displays at all. After I finished the initial boot and configuration, the first thing I did was configure the scaling settings to 200%, so that way I'd be able to read what's on the screen, and once I did that, the problem was completely solved. So it's fairly straightforward with how to solve the DPI issue, but it was still a bit tedious because I could barely see what was on the screen enough to know what to click on to solve the problem, so it took a little bit of trial and error to get the display configured just the right way. But after I fixed the display settings, I immediately noticed how well System76 transferred their distribution to the Pi. Like I mentioned earlier, if you were only looking at screenshots, you probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference. The reason why I specifically stated that you wouldn't notice the difference while looking at screenshots is because you would definitely notice the difference when you go to use this release, and the reason for that is because performance takes a bit of a hit here when it comes to the Raspberry Pi, especially when you compare it to x86 PCs. And part of this is actually to be expected. I mean, you can't really expect a Raspberry Pi 400 to perform even half as well as a computer with a higher-end CPU. Raspberry Pis do legitimately have slower specs. But other distributions, such as Raspberry Pi OS, they include lighter weight components in order to compensate for the lower speed of the Pi. But when it comes to Pop! OS, it seems like they ported it pretty much as is from x86 and just brought all the same software along, for better or worse. And this problem isn't actually specific to Pop! OS. I ran through the same issue when I went to use the official Ubuntu release for the Raspberry Pi. They also include a GNOME release, just like Pop! OS is a GNOME distribution. The Ubuntu distribution also uses GNOME, and I found that to be sluggish as well. I'll talk about the performance later on. I only bring it up now because, well, I'm talking about my first impression of Pop! OS, and unfortunately, that was it. The good thing that I noticed right away is that they did a great job porting their distribution over to the Pi, at least when you look at functionality, but the speed, or lack of speed, was a big problem for me. Now, we'll get back to performance later on in the review, but for right now, I want to switch gears and talk about the actual presentation of the desktop and give you some details about how well they actually ported the functionality over to the Raspberry Pi. And you know what? There's something to be said about a desktop distribution on the Raspberry Pi. There's something strangely appealing about that. In fact, I would say that there's actually major appeal when it comes to using a Raspberry Pi as your desktop computer. I mean, the Raspberry Pi itself was never intended to be that, at least not at first, But, the Linux community wanted that to be the case. They wanted to give that a try. And ever since the Raspberry Pi was first released, people were actually trying to use it as a desktop. Now, of course, with older versions of the Raspberry Pi, you had to make some sacrifices there to get it to work, but people still tried to do it. And then eventually, the Raspberry Pi 400 was released, which is a desktop-focused product from Raspberry Pi. So obviously, they saw that the community wanted to run the Raspberry Pi as a desktop computer, and they facilitated that with the Raspberry Pi 400. So I guess that means that even though initially desktop use really wasn't on the agenda, it ended up being a core feature of the Raspberry Pi because the community deemed it so. And I could definitely understand the appeal of using a Raspberry Pi as your desktop. Compared to x86 PCs, Raspberry Pis are, well, a lot cheaper. You don't have to buy one from a big company like Dell or Lenovo in order to have a computer, and depending on the model, you can get a Raspberry Pi for less than $100. If your SD card goes bad, it's cheaper to replace an SD card than it is to replace a standard hard disk, and it's less time consuming as well. And even if your entire Raspberry Pi goes bad, you just simply buy another one. I mean, it's cheaper to replace a Raspberry Pi than it is to replace a desktop motherboard, for example. Now, I'm not sure if these are the actual reasons why so many people want to use a Raspberry Pi as their desktop. It could even be rebellion, or maybe it's just gaining popularity because we, the users, have more control over Raspberry Pi than we have when it comes to computers manufactured by big-name companies. And Pop! OS caters to the Raspberry Pi so well that you may as well consider it fan service. I mean, almost nothing about the Pi version of Pop! OS makes it obvious that you're not running on x86 hardware. I mean, if you take the responsiveness out of the equation. Take the lock screen, for example. It looks just as good as it does on any desktop or laptop. When I went to install updates, it was the exact same experience as it is on a PC. There was a number next to the PopShop icon on the panel, so I opened it, I went to the Updates tab, and I let it do its thing. No terminal required. When it comes to installing new applications, that process is pretty much the same too. You open up PopShop, you search for an app, you click on it, and then, well, you install it. And the desktop theme even carried over to the Pi version as well, making this quite possibly the most desktop-like image you can get for the Raspberry Pi that I've ever seen. So if you want a PC-like experience on the Raspberry Pi, then System76 has more than delivered here. We even have all the common Linux desktop apps such as LibreOffice, Firefox, an image viewer, a video player, and more. And check this out, we even have auto-tiling as well. I mean, having auto-tiling on the Raspberry Pi alone is enough reason to justify running this. So when it comes to desktop functionality, Pop! OS on the Pi definitely gets a 10 out of 10, no question. But when it comes to performance, unfortunately, that's when things start to go downhill. I mean, the question comes up, should they have ported this over to the Raspberry Pi? I mean, already I could tell you that just because you can doesn't necessarily mean that you should. And when I run Pop! OS on the Raspberry Pi, I mean, there's just lag everywhere. Even simply moving a file window across the screen has lag, opening menus has lag, everything just has a lot of lag. And to make matters worse, I was actually at 46% memory usage before I even opened a single app. I had a completely empty desktop with nothing running, and 46 or so percent of my RAM was used up already. Now that's a lot, especially considering the Raspberry Pi 400 only has 4 gigs of RAM, so as you could tell, that's a big problem. Maybe not so much of a problem if you're running on the 8 gig version of the Raspberry Pi, but you'd still have some performance issues because the CPU is what it is. Now, to be fair, I don't really blame System76 for the sluggish responsiveness of this distribution. Pop! OS itself uses the GNOME desktop, which is my favorite desktop environment. I mean, I use that on each of my computers, and for me, GNOME feels very fast. I find it very responsive. But the problem with GNOME, though, is that, in my opinion, it's just not optimized to run in constrained environments. In my experience, I find that GNOME typically suffers from lag anytime you run it in a virtual machine or on the Raspberry Pi. GNOME is what GNOME is. So I think that might put System76 in a somewhat uncomfortable position. I mean, they have just 2 choices for how to deal with this. Option A is that they could use a different desktop environment altogether and try to port as many Pop! OS features to that desktop environment as they can, but it really wouldn't be the same thing. Option B is just to use the same desktop environment, the same software selections, for better or worse, and just, well, try to get by with a bit of lag. And for this release, they chose to focus on having the same experience as on the desktop in terms of functionality. But I decided to test the performance a bit more and see if there's anything I could do to make it more responsive. My first thought was that maybe it just doesn't handle 4K well. Both my portable display as well as my screen recorder have a 4K resolution. So maybe that's adding to the problem. So I decided to run it with a single display, and then I lowered the resolution down to 1080p. I was hoping that might actually free up some resources, but I didn't really notice much difference. I mean, the performance was a bit better, but not so much that it actually solved the problem. I was still noticing quite a bit of lag, so even though it wasn't as bad, it really wasn't that much better. I also tried a different SD card as well, but the performance was about the same. The SD card that I used for this installation was rated with a read speed of 170 megabytes a second, so it's not the worst SD card in the world, but I think it's pretty decent. I'm sure an SSD would make the performance even better, but I didn't have a chance to try that for this review. When it comes to my overall opinion about Pop! OS on the Raspberry Pi, I feel like my view is a bit mixed. Now, on one hand, it actually is very impressive how well they transferred the desktop experience to the Raspberry Pi. I mean, like I mentioned, if you're looking at screenshots or video footage, you might not be able to tell the difference. But the performance issues were really hard for me to ignore. To be fair, maybe for you, you won't care as much as I do. Maybe you won't notice as much. But the thing is, I did notice it, and I'm mentioning that in the review because it was something that I came across, and in my opinion, the performance is very sluggish. Maybe they really shouldn't have bothered with this release at all, because if somebody uses Pop! OS on the Pi, they find it really slow and unresponsive, they may not want to try Pop! OS on anything else, and it might be doing a disservice to System76 to have something like this that runs so sluggishly. But then I start to think about this in another way, because there's no greater way to fix something than to put it out into the public. If you put something out, if you release something, then everybody is going to try to tweak it, to, try to fix it. Maybe Pop! OS will submit a patch to GNOME itself to make it run better. Maybe a community member might do that. So the fact that they did decide to port this to the Raspberry Pi might actually be a good thing, because even though it's slow, it's still usable. And if that frustrates anyone, maybe they'll be driven to fix the problem themselves. And who knows, maybe some people will get together in the Learn Linux TV forums and find a way to solve this problem, which I encourage you to do, because that's really the whole point here. When we release something that's open source or a Linux distribution, we do so in hopes that people will give back. People will, submit a pull request to make it better. And I hope that's what happens. I mean, the next time I review this distribution, the next time they do release a new version for the Pi, maybe I'll come back and tell you guys that it runs very fast and it's great, all because the community got together and, well, made it better. Or maybe System76 themselves will improve it. Another issue that I ran into with Pop! OS on the Raspberry Pi was that some apps in PopShop just wouldn't install for some reason. At first, I got really excited when I saw that Steam was being offered through PopShop on the Raspberry Pi release. At first, I thought that maybe they were able to find a way to get Steam working on ARM. I don't really think it does normally. So I went to install it and it failed. I tried Slack just as a test and that failed too. And I think the problem is that PopShop isn't filtering apps based on platform, because maybe there is no way to get Steam working on the Raspberry Pi. I don't know. Maybe that's just an x86 thing. Maybe they should have filtered it so it doesn't show up on the list. But other apps I tried to install, like Tilix, that work just fine. So it's a little hit or miss when it comes to installing apps. But overall, even though I am, finding problems with this release, I still recommend that you give it a shot. I mean, honestly, is it really all that big of a deal to have a spare SD card and just give it a spin? I mean, it's free and SD cards are cheap. It's really easy to insert an SD card into a Raspberry Pi. So it probably is a good idea to have a Pop! OS install, lying around on an extra SD card. You might even like it. And if nothing else, maybe you'll find a way to fix it. Or perhaps for you, you won't have the performance issues that I've experienced. Let me know in the comments down below if you've had a chance to test this out, and if so, how is the performance? I look forward to seeing if you guys are having a similar experience or not. That's going to be interesting to find out. So anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next video.